Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be learning about the human respiratory system. So what are our objectives for today? We're going to be looking at the difference between breathing and cellular respiration. Then we're going to be looking at the respiratory tract and its components. Then we'll be looking at gas exchange, then the breathing process, and finally we're going to be looking at common diseases of the respiratory system. This video is going to be split into two parts. We're gonna first focus on the three objectives, and another video we're gonna do the last two objectives. So let's begin. So first, we said we want to distinguish between cellular respiration and breathing. So what is cellular respiration? So cellular respiration is a process that occurs in the mitochondria of our cells. Remember, we said the mitochondria is what is the energy, or we call it the powerhouse of the cell. So it's the powerhouse of the cell. What does that mean? That means it provides our cells with energy. So in what way does it do that? So as we wrote here, it releases energy. It follows this equation. We have glucose, which is C6H12O6, plus oxygen, and we release water, carbon dioxide, and of course we release energy. Okay? So we need oxygen as a reactant, and we have carbon dioxide as a product. Now an important note is carbon dioxide is unhealthy if we have it at a high concentration in our blood. So our body wants to excrete CO2 and wants to intake oxygen. So how do we do that? That's where breathing comes in. So what is breathing? Breathing is the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between our lungs and the environment. So we inhale oxygen and we exhale carbon dioxide. Now another note about breathing, it's a mechanical process, it's not a chemical process, and we will be looking more at it when we talk about the breathing process. And finally, we have two terms that we must know: inhalation versus exhalation, or we can say inspiration versus expiration. Okay? So inhalation, of course, it's when we inhale from the environment into our lungs. Exhalation is the opposite, so we go from the lungs to the environment. So we're done with our first objective. Let's move on now to the respiratory tract. So as you guys can see, we drew out the components of the respiratory tract. So where do we start from? First, we start either from the nose or the mouth. But however, for now, let's just focus as if we're breathing through our nose. So if we're breathing through our nose, first we have nose hairs. Now what is the role of these nose hairs? Their function is to trap large particles that's found in the inhaled air. Okay? So those nose hairs, trap them and don't let them go into the respiratory tract. So air then moves through our nostrils into what? Into the nasal cavity. Now what is the nasal cavity? The nasal cavity is a cavity that separates the nose and the mouth by a soft palate, and it is lined with a mucous membrane. What does that mean? So inside this mucous membrane, we have different types of cells. What do we have? We have cilia. What are cilia? Cilia are hair-like structures, and what is their function? Their function is they have a beating motion. So if we want to think about it, we can have several hair-like structures. Those are the cilia, okay? And then they flick back and forth, okay? Why? To move the mucus, and mucus is produced, now we'll look by what type of cells. They move that mucus that is trapped with pathogens and unwanted particles, okay? They move that outside our body, or it passes through the esophagus where it will die from the stomach acid, okay? So what produces mucus? We have cells called goblet cells. Now these goblet cells are what produce mucus. And what is the role of mucus? Mucus, of course, we said to trap pathogens and to trap unwanted particles, and also it moistens the air, so it prevents the respiratory tract from drying out, okay? And to go back, just a small note on the cilia. Cilia trap that mucus that has the pathogens and the particles, and they flick back and forth to excrete that either through our throat outside our bodies, or as we said, through the esophagus, and then where they will die from the stomach acid. And we also have olfactory cells in our nasal cavity, and their function is basically for smell. We also have a rich shallow blood vessels. And what is the role of these blood vessels? So these blood vessels radiate heat. So if we're breathing in hot air, it's bad. So the role of it is to warm. It warms. If we're breathing in cold air, the shallow blood vessels radiate heat to warm that air that we're breathing in. And we also have turbinal bones, and their function is basically to increase the surface area by making them pass through a narrow passageway. Now, after we move from the nasal cavity, we go to the pharynx. Now, we took the pharynx before, we learned it in the digestive system. So what is the pharynx? The pharynx is a common passageway between the respiratory tract and the alimentary canal. So remember, we said if food wants to go from the pharynx to the esophagus, there was a specific step that has to be made. And what was it? It was the epiglottis. Okay, so the epiglottis should fold to prevent food from entering the respiratory tract and make sure that the food passes from the pharynx into the esophagus, into the stomach, and so on. We don't need to pay attention for that now. Okay? So that's basically what the pharynx is. It's just the common passageway between the respiratory tract and the alimentary canal. After the pharynx, we move to the larynx. Now, what is the function of the larynx? The larynx is also known as the voice box. So what does that mean? It's responsible for the production of sound. It contains vocal cords which produce sound. Now, after we move from the larynx, we move to the trachea. As you guys can see, I drew somewhat of a diagram. It's not that clear, I'm not the best artist out there, but this is what we call the trachea. Now, the trachea is also known as the windpipe, okay? And that's where air passes through before entering the bronchi. Now, we have two bronchus. The plural of bronchus is bronchi. We have a left bronchus and we have a right bronchus. And they lead into the bronchioles and then the alveoli. And as I wrote here, the bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli all make up the lungs, okay? So, what happens in the trachea, or what is the trachea lined up with? What is its function? So the trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles are all lined up with ciliated cells, which we said again are hair-like structures, and with goblet cells, which produce mucus for lubrication and for moistening the air. Now, another note to note is that trachea and bronchi, they have something that bronchioles don't have. And what is that? They have cartilage, and this cartilage is what is C-shaped. So as you guys can see from the diagram a bit, they're basically C-shaped cartilage. That's why we call the cartilage C-shaped. And they also have smooth muscles in between filling up the gaps. Now, what is the role of this cartilage? This cartilage prevents the trachea and bronchi from collapsing, okay? And it also helps in some flexibility, okay? And then we move after the bronchi to the bronchioles. In the bronchioles, we just have smooth muscles. And now, what's the function of these smooth muscles? They can either contract or relax. If they contract, it's a constriction. If they relax, it's a dilation, okay? And then after the bronchioles, we move to the alveoli. Now, I zoomed in a bit of a picture here. Those are the alveoli, okay? And those are the bronchioles, and the main branch is the bronchus, okay? Now, what happens in the alveoli? Now we finished the respiratory tract. We're going to be looking at our third objective for today's video, which is gas exchange. So first step, where does gas exchange occur? It occurs in the alveoli, which are small sacs that are found over here, all over the lungs. There are millions of alveoli, and that's which is a characteristic for it, which helps it in gas exchange. So if we look over here, we zoomed in a bit, we have blood vessels surrounding the alveoli, okay, or blood capillaries. And now what happens? That's where the main exchange occurs. So what is the exchange that occurs? We have oxygen that is coming in from the environment, so O2 from environment, okay, or let's say from the outside, O2 from the outside, comes through what path? Of course, through the respiratory tract, which we just talked about, and it reaches the alveoli. Now, O2 in here is going to leave and enter the blood capillaries by what? This is very important to know. It's a passive diffusion, It's a passive process. Now what does passive diffusion mean, or a passive process? It means no energy is needed, okay? And I'm sure you guys have learned before about the different modes of transport. Passive diffusion goes from high concentration to a low concentration, and that is why no energy is needed for it to occur. So we have a high concentration of O2 in our alveoli, and they're going to exchange with the blood capillaries. They're gonna give the blood capillaries O2, and what will they take from the blood capillaries? The blood capillaries will give them CO2, and this CO2 will be excreted outside. Now, why does that happen? Okay, why does that happen is very important. Let's try to put it here. So we said our cells, our tissues perform cellular respiration. So C6H12O6, okay, plus 6O2 gives us 6H2O plus 6CO2 plus energy. And what did we say at the start of our video? We said our tissues and our cells need oxygen, okay, for them to perform cellular respiration to get energy. Now that is why our alveoli give O2 to our blood tissues. That's why we have a high concentration of O2 in our alveoli and a low concentration of O2 in our blood capillaries. Why do we have a low concentration in our blood capillaries? Because they are using up all of this O2 to perform cellular respiration. And now the same thing for CO2. We have a low concentration of CO2 in our alveoli, and we have a high concentration of CO2 in our blood capillaries. Why do we have a high concentration of CO2 in our blood capillaries? Again, because they are performing cellular respiration, and a product of cellular respiration is CO2. So that's where the gas exchange occurs. And now we also have some conditions for gas exchange to occur. We mentioned over there that the gas exchange that occurs is between the alveoli and the blood capillaries. The alveoli give oxygen to the blood capillaries, and the blood tissues or blood capillaries give CO2 back to the alveoli, and that is the exchange that occurs. Now, some characteristics of the alveoli that help them in performing gas exchange. What are these characteristics? They have a large surface area. As I mentioned before, we have millions. Okay, we have millions of alveoli. That means they have a large surface area. They have a rich blood supply, as we saw here. We have a lot of vessels surrounding them, making the exchange way easier. They have a thin membrane and they're moist. Okay, thin membrane. Let's look at it. Why is it important to have a thin membrane? Okay, so if I want the exchange to occur between the alveoli and the blood capillaries, and vice versa, between the blood capillaries and the alveoli. Now, if I have a thick, okay, let's say they have a thick cell membrane, okay? Now, for oxygen to cross from the alveoli into the blood capillaries is going to take more time. And same thing for the CO2 to cross from the blood capillaries into the alveoli, it needs more time to cross that thick layer. However, if it was just one cell thick, that means it's a very thin layer. O2 can easily leave and CO2 can easily enter, making this exchange process super fast. So that's another important note. And we also have constant ventilation. Now, what does constant ventilation mean? Okay, so our body and our cells are always performing cellular respiration for energy. We need energy for all of the reactions most of the reactions that happen in our body. So this process is always occurring. So we're always going to have a high concentration of CO2 in our blood vessels, and we're always going to have a high concentration of oxygen in our alveoli. And we said the gas exchange process is what? It's a passive process. It doesn't need energy. It goes from a high concentration into a low concentration. So that's why, since we always have the high concentration of O2 in our alveoli and a high concentration of CO2 in our blood vessels, we're always going to have constant ventilation, oxygen coming in, CO2 leaving, and that's an important characteristic for gas exchange to occur. And finally, we have one more thing to look at, which are our lungs. Our lungs are the main organ for respiration. Now, to look at the structure of the lungs, they're surrounded by two pleural membranes. The inner one is around the rib cage and the outer one is around the lungs. So let's say this IM is inner membrane, OM is outer membrane, okay? So we have, what do we call this? It's an empty space. What do we call empty space? It's a cavity, okay? So what do we call it? We call it the pleural cavity. Now what is it filled with? Okay, it's filled with something called pleural fluid. Now what is the role of it? It's just lubrication and prevents the friction between these two membranes while breathing. And now we have some associated parts with the lungs that ease the breathing process. So for example, if I'm going to breathe in, you can see the volume of my lungs increases. And if I'm exhaling, so I'm breathing out, you see the volume of my lungs decreases. Now what helps change the volume of our lungs? We have the intercostal muscles. They can either be split into external intercostal muscles or internal intercostal muscles. And we also have diaphragm, which contracts and relaxes depending if we're inhaling or we're exhaling. And we're going to be looking at the function of those two when they contract and when they relax when we talk about the breathing process in our next video. Thank you guys for watching today's video. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and see you soon.